Welcome to the Crypto Layer HQ. Today I'll be covering whether Bitcoin is a forward leading indicator and if it is telling us something about the broader market and the stock market, more specifically the S&P. So if we look at prior times in history when Bitcoin had a drop, it oftentimes followed with the S&P having a drop, and Bitcoin gave us warnings before the S&P did. So if we look, for example, back in January 2025, we can see Bitcoin topped in Jan 2025 and the S&P continued to make new all-time highs until February 19, 2025. And as we can see, Bitcoin already started to drop. We can see Bitcoin drop from approximately 11% as the S&P was still making new all-time highs, and then eventually the S&P started to drop and we got this 18% correction, which for the S&P is quite a bit. We can see Bitcoin already started to give us a warning that potentially we were going to get a pullback in the S&P. If we go back to last cycle in November 2021, this was a big signal. So Bitcoin made a top on November 10, 2021, and we can see Bitcoin had already dropped by 33% by the 4th of January 2022. And the S&P was still making new all-time highs. And then eventually the S&P made its top, put its top in, and started to drop. And we can see the S&P dropped 25%, which is pretty significant for the S&P. So we can see this is another good example of Bitcoin starting to drop, the S&P continuing to make new all-time highs, and then eventually the S&P starting to drop. But Bitcoin had already given us the pre-warning signs. If we go back to the cycle before that, and we look in December 2017, Bitcoin made a top, and then the S&P continued to make new all-time highs, and Bitcoin kept on dropping. We can see Bitcoin dropped about 43% as S&P continued to make new all-time highs, and then eventually the S&P had a very sudden drop of about 10%. So we can see, again, Bitcoin started to give us pre-warning signs that potentially we were going to have a correction in the S&P. And we can even see, if we look throughout the bear market, where we kind of went sideways in 2018, 2019, and the first half of 2020, we can see from that point the S&P also did spend quite a bit of time not doing that much. We also went sideways, we had a dip. So as Bitcoin wasn't able to do much, the S&P also wasn't able to do much. That takes us back to today. So we can see Bitcoin has made a top and it's had a very big drop so far. We can see the drop so far up to today is 43%, and to the low is about 51%. The S&P has continued to make new all-time highs, but that brings into question, is Bitcoin telling us something? Is it warning that we're potentially going to maybe have a top in the S&P soon, let's say in the coming weeks or months? And since Bitcoin had such a big drop, maybe the S&P will find a top and also have a correction. It's always difficult to predict corrections in the S&P and drops, but I do believe that Bitcoin is very good at sniffing liquidity and being a forward-looking indicator, and knowing in terms of when we have big corrections in Bitcoin that potentially liquidity is drying up in the overall markets, and we will eventually see corrections in other markets such as the S&P.